She watched her husband laugh with someone else, at the gate meant for their anniversary trip. He didn't know she'd seen everything, or that she wasn't boarding with him. What happened next at gate 17 left the entire airport silent, until her voice came through the mic. Watch until the end to see how one woman exposed betrayal and reclaimed her freedom. Margaret Holloway stood in front of the airport's sliding doors, her travel tote clutched neatly in one hand, her passport in the other. She paused just for a second as a gust of wind swept the hair gently across her forehead. The hum of suitcase wheels, the rhythmic beeping of scanners, and muffled boarding announcements created a strange kind of music. The sound of transitions. She thought it might feel exciting. It didn't. Beside her, Charles was already striding forward, his silver rolling bag trailing behind him like a shadow. "Come on, Maggie," he said over his shoulder. Not quite impatient, but not warm either. That tone had become familiar in the past few years. Efficient, detached. Maggie followed. They were headed to Santorini, a place she'd long dreamed of. Whitewashed buildings, cobalt rooftops, soft island winds. Those were supposed to make up for the growing silence between them. Charles had booked it as a surprise after forgetting their anniversary in March. At the time, she'd thought it was sweet. Now something about the trip felt rushed, like a cover-up for guilt. At the check-in counter, Charles handled everything, flashing his signature smile at the young attendant. Maggie tried to scan the itinerary on the screen, but he subtly moved his body to block her view. "I've got it, Maggie," he said, slipping the boarding passes into his coat pocket before she could even glimpse the seat numbers. "I'm not helpless, Charles," she replied, a gentle edge in her voice. "Didn't say you were. Just trying to move things along." Maggie nodded, but her stomach knotted. He hadn't let her touch the itinerary. He'd insisted on checking her bags himself. And for the past week, he'd been unusually absorbed in his phone, typing furiously, smiling softly at texts he refused to explain. When she'd asked who Elle was, he claimed it was Larry from the office. Larry didn't send emojis. They moved through security, his hand barely brushing hers as they passed through the scanners. Maggie's eyes wandered to his wrist. The watch she'd gifted him last year still gleamed, but he hadn't worn it in weeks until this morning. Intentional. Every detail suddenly felt rehearsed. They reached the terminal's upscale waiting lounge. Charles gestured for her to sit while he went to grab them coffee. "Flat white, right?" She nodded, trying to smile. She used to find joy in these moments, traveling together, holding hands while waiting for flights, laughing over overpriced croissants. But lately, even silence between them felt louder than before. She watched his figure disappear into the coffee line, his phone already back in hand. He turned away from her, shoulders slightly hunched, lips moving faintly. Talking to someone who wasn't her. Maggie sat upright, her fingers fidgeting with the zipper of her bag. She tried to shake it off. Maybe she was being paranoid. Maybe this was what 35 years of marriage looked like. Less passion, more practicality. But then she remembered the scent. 3 weeks ago, she'd taken Charles's blazer to the dry cleaner and caught a whiff of something unfamiliar. Not her perfume, not aftershave, something floral and sharp, like jasmine. When she'd asked him about it, he said he'd leaned over a colleague's desk and brushed past her diffuser. She wanted to believe him, but a diffuser didn't leave marks. He returned with 2 coffees, handing one to her casually. His phone buzzed again as he sat, and he turned it face down. "Who's messaging you?" she asked gently. "Work," he sipped. "We have a product launch coming up, and I told them I'd stay reachable." "Even on vacation?" Charles didn't answer. Maggie looked out at the planes, watching one disappear into the clouds. She used to feel excited by the unknown. Now she just felt cold. She didn't know why yet, but she knew something wasn't right. She could feel it, the way you feel a storm before it breaks. In the distance, a voice announced a delayed flight over the speakers. People murmured. Charles reached for his phone again. Maggie didn't know it then, but the woman he was texting wasn't in another city. She was already inside the terminal. And Maggie was just a few hours away from reclaiming her dignity. loudly, and with witnesses. Maggie stirred the foam in her untouched coffee, her gaze flicking between the terminal windows and Charles's unreadable expression. He scrolled through his phone with a casualness that didn't feel casual at all. Occasionally he chuckled softly, just under his breath, just enough to make her heart tug with suspicion. He hadn't laughed like that with her in months. The buzz of travelers blended into a soft drone around them. Maggie couldn't focus. Her instincts, those quiet whispers we often ignore, were getting louder with every passing minute. "I'm going to the restroom," Charles said, already rising. "Be back in a few." Maggie nodded. She waited until he turned the corner toward the far side of the lounge, then followed. She wasn't proud of it, but she needed the truth. As she walked, she stayed a few paces behind, careful to blend into the crowd. Charles didn't head toward the restrooms. He veered left, toward the hallway where crew members and lounge staff entered through a private door. Maggie paused near a large planter, partially hidden by a promotional display for a credit card. And there he was. Charles stood just a few feet away, talking to a young woman in a flight attendant uniform. She was beautiful, tall with smooth dark hair tied into a sleek bun and eyes lined with confidence. Her name tag read, Alina. Alina touched his arm briefly, and Charles didn't pull away. In fact, he smiled. That smile, the one Maggie hadn't seen in years, the one that once belonged to her. Alina leaned in, whispering something, and Charles laughed again. Maggie felt something hollow inside her shift and crack. She watched them, not for long, just long enough to know this wasn't innocent, just long enough to see her suspicions reflected in the way they stood. Too close, too familiar. A man doesn't lean into a woman like that if he's only passing time before boarding. Charles gently tapped Alina's hand, looked around, and said something that made her blush. Then she walked away toward the staff corridor, leaving Charles alone. He pulled out his phone the second she left. Maggie stepped back, returning to her seat before he noticed she was gone. She took out her phone and stared at the lock screen. Her hands were shaking. She wasn't the kind of woman who confronted people in public. She wasn't one for scenes. But this wasn't a rumor. It wasn't a suspicion. It was real. He came back minutes later, face neutral, sipping his coffee like nothing had happened. "Long line at the restroom," he said, sitting beside her. She murmured. She could smell it now, the same perfume she'd detected on his blazer. Jasmine, sharp and sweet. It clung to his collar. "You know," Maggie said slowly, "I read something interesting the other day. It said that most affairs are uncovered by accident, that it's rarely the big things. More often it's the details. Perfume, different cologne, changes in behavior." Charles blinked at her. "That's so?" She nodded and smiled. "Yes, details always give it away." He turned his attention to the boarding screen. "Our gate's been updated. Looks like it's gate 17 now." Maggie didn't move. Her thoughts were racing, but her face remained calm. There were no more doubts to wrestle with. She had seen the truth in his body language, in the way his eyes lit up for someone else, in the touch that should have belonged to her. For a moment she wanted to scream, to cry, to slap him with the betrayal she felt burning in her chest. But instead she reached for her phone, quietly, without him noticing. She opened her photo app and zoomed in on the image she'd captured earlier. Charles, Alina. The touch on the arm, the lean in, the intimacy caught mid-frame. She saved it to a folder labeled Final Boarding. Then she opened another app, one that Charles didn't know she had access to, their joint investment portal. Quietly, she began the steps to temporarily freeze the account under suspicious activity, something her lawyer had coached her on weeks ago when Maggie first expressed her concerns. She wasn't sure what she'd do next, but she was done ignoring the details. The airport lounge had grown more crowded, and the low hum of boarding announcements played on loop in the background. Maggie sat silently, the noise around her fading as she stared at the departure board. Gate 17. That was where the plane would take them. Together, but not really. She glanced at Charles. He was pretending to read a magazine, but his eyes flicked up every so often, toward the corridor Alina had disappeared into earlier. Maggie didn't need a confession anymore. She had what she needed. But still, part of her wanted to understand. How long? Why? Was it worth destroying everything they'd built? Charles folded the magazine shut and stretched. Boarding should start soon. You want to go stretch your legs? I'm fine here, Maggie replied evenly. You go ahead. He hesitated for a moment, then nodded and walked off, probably trying to find Alina again. As soon as he was out of sight, Maggie opened her bag and pulled out a small manila folder. Inside were documents she'd quietly prepared over the past month. Bank authorizations, a legal retainer, a signed draft of divorce papers, dated but not yet delivered. She had never planned to use them, not unless she was absolutely sure. Now she was. She closed the folder, zipped it away and opened her phone again. The photos she'd taken of Charles and Alina still sat on her screen like a scar. She stared at it for a long time, then messaged it to her lawyer with a short note. It's confirmed. Initiate the process. A simple text, but it carried the weight of 42 years of marriage. Maggie stood and walked over to the large flight display monitor in the center of the terminal. A delay. The screen now showed boarding, delayed 35 minutes. It was just enough time, enough for her to think, really think, about what she wanted this moment to be. Did she want to walk away quietly, take the next cab home, and let him return to a wife who simply disappeared? Or did she want to let him feel what she felt? In real time, in public, no yelling, no drama, just the truth. Unmistakable, undeniable. She chose the latter. At the corner of the terminal, she spotted a small airline service desk manned by a young airport staffer. He looked barely 30, polite but distracted. She approached slowly. "Hi there," she said warmly. He looked up. "Yes, ma'am? Can I help you?" She leaned in slightly. "This might sound odd, but I was wondering, would it be possible to make a brief announcement over the gate microphone?" He blinked. Like a surprise message? For a birthday or something?" "Something like that," Maggie said. Her voice didn't waver. "It's for my husband. We're celebrating something special today, and I just want to say a few words before boarding." The staffer hesitated. "Technically, that's only for employees, but I mean, if it's brief, I could allow it." She smiled, genuinely. "Thank you. I promise it'll be short." He handed her a laminated card with access to the microphone next to the gate check-in desk. She walked over slowly, holding the card in both hands, her heart pounding. Not with fear, but with focus. Charles was back now, standing near a gate 17, scanning the crowd. Alina was nowhere in sight, yet. Maggie could feel the moment arriving. Not in some dramatic, theatrical way. It was more like a tide finally hitting the shore after building silently for miles. She took one deep breath, closed her eyes, and whispered to herself, "This isn't revenge. This is recognition." She opened her eyes, placed the laminated card into the reader, and gently lifted the microphone. A soft beep. The terminal quieted just slightly as the microphone came alive. Her voice, measured, clear, echoed through gate 17. Silence followed Margaret's announcement, brief, suspended, sharp. Then came the collective intake of breath. Passengers standing near gate 17 turned toward Charles, phones frozen mid-scroll, conversations cut short mid-sentence. Even the background announcements, the usual monotone reminders about unattended baggage, seemed to dim under the weight of what had just happened. Charles Holloway stood frozen, blinking rapidly, as if the microphone might have glitched, as if he could convince himself that he had misheard. But he hadn't. Maggie stood behind the gate desk, calmly returning the mic to its stand. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't look around for applause. Her eyes, green and steady, were locked on her husband. Charles's jaw flexed. His first instinct wasn't shame. It was panic. His eyes darted around, trying to see who had heard, who was watching, who was filming. A woman across from him, mid-40s, smart suit, slowly lowered her phone to her lap and stared directly at him. Another passenger, a teenager wearing headphones, whispered, "No way," to his friend. And then Alina appeared. She stepped through the crew door near the gate, her uniform pristine, her rolling bag trailing behind her. Her smile faltered the instant she saw the stillness in the terminal. She spotted Charles immediately, and then she spotted Maggie. Maggie didn't flinch. Charles turned to Alina like a drowning man reaching for anything that floated, but Alina, now acutely aware that the spotlight had shifted to her, took 2 cautious steps backward. She understood instantly. Passengers were murmuring now. A few pretended not to eavesdrop while sneaking glances. A middle-aged man muttered to his wife, "You never know what people are hiding." She nodded solemnly, eyes never leaving Maggie. Charles took a few slow steps toward his wife. "Maggie," he hissed, trying to smile, trying to keep the situation under control. "What the hell are you doing?" "I think it's pretty clear," she replied. Her voice didn't carry the weight of fury. It carried finality. He lowered his voice further. "This isn't the place for this." She raised her brow ever so slightly. "Then maybe you should have kept your affair out of the airport lounge." Alina took another step back and began pulling her suitcase toward the jet bridge. One of the flight crew supervisors stepped in front of her, lips pursed, saying something quietly but firm. Alina's expression shifted to defensiveness, then fear. Maggie caught the moment. That was all she needed. "I didn't want to embarrass you," Maggie said, addressing Charles. "For weeks I gave you chances. I begged for honesty. I let myself believe maybe I was imagining things. But you brought her here. You didn't even have the decency to lie well." Charles tried again. "Look, it wasn't serious. It didn't mean anything." Maggie blinked. "You gave her my anniversary trip, my seat, my husband." He opened his mouth to respond, but she held up her hand. "No, I don't need your explanations anymore." From the side, a TSA officer approached, clearly aware of the commotion. "Ma'am, sir, is everything all right here?" Maggie nodded with a calm that felt foreign and liberating. "We're fine. Just not flying together today." The officer lingered for a moment, then nodded and stepped aside. Charles rubbed his forehead, trying to think, trying to salvage what couldn't be saved. "Can we at least talk about this in private?" "No," she said. "You chose to do this in public. I'm simply responding in kind." Her voice wasn't bitter. It was anchored, and that was what made it powerful. People expect rage in moments like these. They don't expect restraint. And it made every word she said feel heavier. Charles glanced back toward the gate, toward the path Alina had vanished down. For the first time, he looked truly unsure. Not guilty. Not sorry. Just caught. Maggie reached into her bag and pulled out a thin envelope. "Here," she said, placing it into his hand. "What's this?" he asked, brows pinched. "Instructions," she replied, "on how to live without me." She turned then, slowly, deliberately, and walked back toward the main terminal. As she passed the service desk, the young staffer who'd handed her the mic looked up, wide-eyed. She smiled gently. "Thank you," she said. He gave her a slow nod. He would remember her for a long time. And as Maggie disappeared into the crowd, Charles stood alone in a space that had become suddenly too quiet for comfort, holding an envelope heavier than any suitcase he'd packed. "Passenger Charles Holloway. Charles Holloway, this is your wife, Margaret. I just want to wish you a safe flight, with your mistress, the flight attendant assigned to this very gate. I hope she's worth the 42 years you just threw away." The crowd went still. Heads turned. Charles froze in place. And for the first time in decades, Maggie felt her spine straighten, not from habit, but from power. Charles stared at the envelope like it was ticking. Around him, the whispers kept growing. No one shouted, no one clapped, but the murmurs carried judgment, quiet, slicing, collective judgment. It was worse than screaming. The TSA officer who'd approached earlier stood by the gate, arms crossed, eyes scanning the area. He wasn't intervening. He didn't need to. Maggie had made no threats, no scene, only facts, clearly spoken, and heard by all. Charles turned the envelope over in his hands, then finally opened it. Inside, a letter from Maggie, typed but signed in ink. A copy of the divorce petition, already filed. A list of assets with the words, "Transferred to Maggie Holloway," circled in red. And a short note paperclipped to the front. "If you're going to lie, Charles, try not to do it so lazily." He looked up, frantic, but Maggie was gone. The crowd began to thin as the boarding announcement resumed. The gate agent called for Group 1, and people reluctantly stood, torn between watching the fallout and catching their flight. Charles stood at the edge of it all, his lips pressed together, hands trembling as he stuffed the documents back into the envelope. From the side of the gate, Alina emerged again, escorted by a senior crew supervisor. Her face was pale now, her eyes darting from Charles to the passengers boarding. The supervisor was mid-lecture, speaking low but stern, her body language unmistakable. Alina stopped walking when she reached Charles. "I didn't know she'd be here," she whispered sharply. He said nothing. "I told you this wasn't a good idea." Still nothing. "You need to fix this," she added. That jolted him. "Fix it?" he muttered, voice rising slightly. "You think I can fix this?" A nearby passenger paused to glance at them. Alina noticed, then dropped her tone. "Look, I didn't sign up for public humiliation." "You knew what this was," Charles hissed. "You knew I was married." She stepped back. "I also thought you had some control over your life." With that, she walked toward the jet bridge without looking back. Charles stood alone again. The gate agent called the next boarding group, and people began filing past him, some with pointed stares, others pretending not to see him at all. Back near the escalators, Maggie watched it all unfold. She wasn't hiding. She stood tall, her coat buttoned, her travel tote resting neatly at her side. She hadn't moved far. She simply wanted to witness the end of the performance, the one he'd started. Charles finally saw her again. Their eyes met across the terminal. He didn't come toward her. He just stood there, shoulders slightly slouched, envelope dangling from his hand like a weight he couldn't shake. Maggie gave him a nod. Not angry, not vindictive, just finished. She turned and walked toward the central atrium, where a small cafe overlooked the boarding gates, a place where people sipped tea and waited for flights to change their lives. She didn't cry. Not here. Not anymore. Instead, she took a seat near the glass and placed her phone face down on the table. Her reflection in the window looked older than she remembered, but stronger too. It took her 42 years to realize she'd been carrying someone else's baggage. Now she was done. As she sipped her tea, the boarding door closed behind Charles. He didn't get on the flight. He didn't walk toward her. He didn't say a word. And for once, that silence was hers to keep. Margaret Holloway sat in the cafe overlooking the terminal, a quiet sanctuary above the chaos. Below her, Charles remained frozen near Gate 17, holding the remnants of a life he thought he had neatly compartmentalized. In his hands, the truth weighed more than any carry-on. But Margaret wasn't thinking about him anymore. She stirred her tea slowly, the delicate clink of the spoon oddly grounding. Her mind drifted, not back to the betrayal, but further back, to the day she started preparing for this very moment. It had been a Wednesday afternoon 4 weeks ago. She was home alone, folding laundry when Charles's iPad, rarely used, carelessly synced, buzzed with a notification. A message preview had popped up before the screen locked. "Alina, Gate 12 again, hope you're still wearing that cologne." Margaret stared at the message, frozen. She didn't scream. She didn't confront him that night. Instead, she went to their bedroom, locked the door quietly, and sat with a legal pad for 3 hours, writing out every account they shared, every asset she'd contributed to, every line in their marriage she had ignored in the name of commitment. And then she called Julia. Julia had been her college roommate and was now one of the sharpest divorce attorneys in the city. She'd offered her services once before, years ago when Margaret had suspected Charles of harmless flirting with a coworker. Margaret had laughed it off then. Not this time. By Friday, the paperwork had been drafted. Julia didn't push. She simply said, "If you want to file it, I'll be ready." Margaret spent the next few weeks watching. She noticed Charles's patterns, his sudden interest in booking solo business trips, his tendency to shower immediately after coming home, the growing smile he reserved for texts, not sent by her. He'd once held her like that, kissed her forehead the way he now kissed his phone screen when he thought she wasn't looking. She began shifting funds from their joint account into one held in her name, quietly, legally. Julia made sure it was airtight. She canceled her own credit cards and applied for new ones. She updated the deed on her mother's property to reflect sole ownership. She even packed a small folder labeled Plan B and kept it in her closet, next to the box of old anniversary cards she couldn't bring herself to throw out. When Charles suggested the trip to Santorini as a surprise, Margaret felt the irony wrap itself around her like a cold scarf. He thought he was outsmarting her. He didn't know she'd already booked her own return flight. Back in the cafe, she watched a toddler press their nose to the glass, watching the planes taxi below. The mother laughed gently, guiding her child's hand along the window, tracing the wings. Margaret blinked against the emotion in her throat. That used to be her, a young mother with wide eyes and endless hope, a woman who believed that love conquered all, that betrayal only happened in stories or to people who weren't careful enough. She had been careful, too careful, for too long. And that was why today mattered. Not to humiliate Charles, not even to punish him, but to unshackle herself from silence, from denial, from the slow erosion of dignity that came with being lied to by someone who used to love her. She glanced at her phone again. A new message from Julia. "Everything filed. Consider yourself officially free." Margaret smiled softly, not out of celebration, but relief. She looked up and saw him. Charles, standing at the top of the escalator, searching the cafe. He spotted her. Their eyes locked. He took one slow step forward, then stopped. Maybe he wanted to explain. Maybe he thought an apology would make a difference. But there was nothing left to fix. The damage wasn't new. It had just become visible. Margaret reached for her coat and stood. She didn't walk toward him. She didn't wave. She simply turned and walked toward the glass doors leading to the exit. With every step, she felt lighter. And Charles remained standing, just like he always had. Too late, too distant, too unsure of what he had destroyed until it stood up and walked away. Outside the terminal, the air was warmer than Margaret expected. A soft breeze rustled the edge of her blouse as she walked slowly across the pavement toward the taxi stand. The airport's chaos buzzed behind her, but it no longer reached her. It was like walking out of a bad dream, one she'd been stuck in for far too long. She didn't look back. Inside, Charles remained near the cafe, pacing, phone in hand. He called her once, no answer. Then again, straight to voicemail. He stared at the screen like it held a spell that might rewind time. But it didn't. Maggie had turned it off the moment she stepped into the sunlight. She slid into the back seat of the cab and gave the driver an address. Not to their home, but to a small bed and breakfast she'd booked on her own weeks ago. A weekend retreat by the coast. No questions, no plans, just silence and the sound of waves. The driver nodded and they pulled away from the curb. As the car sped toward the highway, Maggie leaned her head back and closed her eyes. She didn't cry. That had already been done. Weeks of silent tears behind bathroom doors and at kitchen sinks where no one could see her break. Now all that remained was clarity and freedom. The kind she never thought she'd have to earn this way. Back inside the airport, Charles sat slumped in one of the empty lounge chairs, the envelope open on his lap. Every word of Maggie's letter seemed louder now than her public call-out had been. "You stopped seeing me years ago. I kept shrinking to fit what you needed. And when I no longer fit the fantasy, you replaced me without even the decency of good lies." He read it again and again. He called Alina. No answer. Called her twice. Still nothing. A voice on the intercom announced the final boarding for their flight to Santorini. He was supposed to be sipping champagne by now, pretending to be in love with a woman who made him feel younger, more powerful, less married. Instead, he was alone. His marriage? Gone. His mistress? Vanishing with every delay. His credibility? Shattered. He rose slowly and walked toward the glass wall overlooking the tarmac. The plane they were supposed to board had begun to taxi away. Not just from the gate, from his life. And Maggie? Well, he had underestimated her. Always had. At the B&B, Margaret stepped into a quiet room filled with the scent of fresh lavender and the sound of distant surf. She sat by the window and removed her shoes, letting her tired feet rest on the hardwood floor. For the first time in years, she wasn't needed by anyone. She wasn't someone's schedule keeper, someone's emotional landing strip, someone's ignored voice in the dark. She was simply herself. And that was more than enough. She reached into her purse and pulled out her favorite book, one Charles always made fun of her for rereading. She opened it to a random page and smiled. The room was small. The view wasn't Santorini. But peace, she realized, didn't come with a view. It came with a decision. A choice to stop begging to be chosen. Far behind her, Charles finally exited the airport, but the world didn't stop to offer him sympathy. No one reached out. No one explained what had happened. Because they'd all seen it. And more importantly, so had he. For years, he had convinced himself Margaret was lucky to have him. But in a single day, she'd proved what he truly was. Ordinary, predictable, replaceable. And she was so much more than he remembered. The last time he would ever see her would be as she walked away. Hair catching sunlight, shoulders tall, head unbent. That image would haunt him longer than any divorce filing. It would remind him, some women don't fight for space in your life. They leave you to drown in it. The morning sun spilled through gauzy curtains, casting soft gold light across the wooden floorboards of the bed and breakfast. Margaret sat on the edge of the window seat, legs tucked under her, sipping warm tea from a chipped porcelain mug. Outside, waves rolled in rhythmically against the shore, steady, patient, powerful. They reminded her of who she used to be, and who she had finally returned to. In the stillness of that coastal room, Margaret allowed herself to remember, not the betrayal, but the woman before it, the woman she'd tucked away while trying to make a marriage work that had long stopped working. She had been vibrant once, curious, tender. She'd given love as if it would be enough to hold everything together, and when the cracks appeared, she'd worked harder, blamed herself, tried again, and again, until one day her husband's silence had become a wall, and his smile, once her safe place, had become a stranger's mask. She took another sip of tea. This trip wasn't what she had planned, but in many ways, it was what she needed. Not the white sand beaches or ocean villas of Santorini, but this, a modest room, a sunrise just for her, a future with no one to explain herself to. She looked down at her phone and saw a single missed call from Charles. No voicemail. The last thread, frayed and dangling. She deleted it without a second thought. Later that afternoon, Maggie walked along the rocky beach just below the inn. The tide was coming in, and the wind carried a hint of salt and eucalyptus. She paused to pick up a small, perfectly round stone and held it in her palm. 42 years. That's how long she'd been someone's wife, someone's mother, someone's afterthought. And now she was her own beginning. She threw the stone into the ocean and watched the ripples spread outward, wider and wider, until it disappeared into the horizon.